talking 200 to 300 billion. So while we've just hit 4 billion cell phones, if we really connect everything, we're talking about a lot more information. And the question is, what happens when we face that deluge? And how are we going to handle that? How are we going to collaborate over it? We heard a lot about collaboration. How are we going to find value in it? So those are some of the questions. How are we going to flow it around? How are we going to protect it? How are we going to keep it secure? So I want to talk about how we're going to protect ourselves from the coming flood. And I think it's worth thinking about, because resiliency turns out to be a really important part of the discussion here. So how do we handle the flood? I've used flood, I've said liquidity, things flowing all over the place. My talk is going to be sort of about liquidity of information. Now, I'll start with a little overhead projection presentation. I'm going to actually focus on nature. Because while we look at nature to figure out alternative energy things and we think about the environment, I don't know that we study nature that much when we think about information. And nature's a pretty interesting animal in this respect. Nature's already handled this huge number of devices. My body, your body, has trillions of cells. And it's an information system in its own right? And you don't reboot every month. You'll go for like 80 years without a system failure, right? So nature's figured something out here. It's a complex information system. Every one of us has more sensors and more displays and more controls than the world times a million. We have a lot of stuff. And so, what can we maybe learn from nature to inform what's going on with our information systems? Maybe we study energy production in nature, but we should maybe study information and how information flows and how an economy is formed in nature with information. So, this is about the most complex thing we can find that handles information. I mean, if you think about humans, how long have humans been handling information? I mean, maybe if you go back to maybe the 1950s with Claude Shannon and his theory of information, or maybe if you go back to Gutenberg, go all the way back there, we've been handling information in the form of books. Maybe if you go even further back, go back 4,000 or 6,000 years, and the idea of symbols and writing systems. We have been dealing with information for maybe 6,000 years, right? So how long has nature been coping with information? How long has it been managing it? It's an interesting question. Let's look at how long nature's been handling information. It's been handling it, keep going, it's been handling it for a long time. You gotta kind of shuffle these sheets here. It turns out that nature's been handling information for about 3 billion years. Maybe we should pay attention a little bit to what nature does and how it handles information. And this will make more sense as we really start to say, how are we going to handle connectivity if we succeed? And where are we going to drive some value? So what can nature teach us about computing systems? And I want to talk about that a bit. And at the end, I'll wrap it back around to what happens when you actually employ some of nature's ideas to build systems and what kind of value you can get out of them. We can start with a basic observation down at sort of the very basic level. There are these sort of different layers. Atoms make up molecules, molecules cells, cells organs, organ systems. They make up me and you, and they can all be distributed and identified and looked at as sort of separate layers of complexity. Right? And this is a really important pattern from nature. This pattern is called semantic layering or layered semantics. And the idea is that the atoms don't need to know what they're going to be made into. They're just stable platforms that happen to be made into molecules. The molecules don't need to know that they're going to be made into cells. The cells don't actually know they're made into organs. These layers of semantics, simple things are simple and become foundations, is something we really need to look at because that's how all super complex systems evolve. I didn't mention DNA. Maybe I should put it sort of between molecules and cells. DNA is actually nature's way of storing information. This is sort of nature's little container for information. And it carries it in the form of genes. If you think about, a chromosome, it has all these different genes on it. And that's how we share information. It's sort of all information, too. It's not just the way humans store information. It turns out that it is life's way of encoding it. It is life's way of copying information. It's life's way of replicating it and sending it out all over the place. And It's the standard container. It's sort of like a shipping container for information in nature. And it's used by all nature. I mean, if you look at anything biological, it uses genes in the form, of DNA put together into chromosomes. So this is a design pattern from nature called containerization. It sounds pretty simple, right? Come up with a basic container and use it everywhere. And in fact, we benefited from it in shipping. The shipping container was actually a major way that we flattened the world and really expanded worldwide commerce. It's mutable, it's changeable, it's just a standard container. You can add things to it, just like chromosomes. You can add genes, you can take them off, you can mutate them. It's just this standard thing. And it turned out that there was a time before shipping containers. And I don't think people necessarily remember that time. It was a while ago. But if you think about it, before shipping containers, you had longshoremen, and they worked on the docks, and they had to make sure that they put stuff in nets, and they had to, when they were piling, hey, don't put those anvils on top of the bananas. That's good, okay. So you had to make sure that you pile things very carefully. It was super time intensive. And when the shipping container came into practice, which is maybe the 1960s was the first real decade, all you needed to know was the dimensions of the container. And then you could build all sorts of wild new value. You could build ships, you could build boats, you could build trucks. All you needed to agree on was this shipping container and its dimensions. And so, while it doesn't seem very sexy, the shipping container was actually one of the biggest revolutions we've ever had. And it was really modeled after nature. Nature uses this very basic containerization scheme. So this turned out to be a pretty big deal. In the decade after containerization took hold, if you were to look at it, you'd actually find that, huge things were happening. Manufactured goods and the shipping of it were like 2 times the amount of the actual goods themselves, just shipping it around, and 2.5 times economic output, right? So there's a wonderful book out there called The Box. It studies how shipping containers actually changed the world. But it really made worldwide commerce happen. And it was just this adoption of a simple container. Now you're trying to probably figure out, what does the container, what does a shipping container have to do with smart grid, with connectivity? And I'll kind of bring it back around to that. I want to go back to DNA for a second and talk about something called information liquidity. DNA was a common currency, just as a shipping container has become a common currency to move goods around. It's nature's way of moving information, storing it, replicating it, copying it, moving it around. So this is sort of a way that it's recomposed in unimaginable numbers all over the world. And what's important is DNA streams right across species, boundary, and generational boundaries. So it turns out to be something that our generation can use and our next generations can use as well. And you might say, why is that important? And I guess, I'll tie it back to money now. Let's tie it back to currency. Liquid currency was the game-changing innovation in economics, right? Before we had liquid currency, it was a very different world out there, right? We came up with this idea of a currency that we could use between different cultures, different enclaves, different states, different countries. This was a big game changer. Before that, we had barter systems, right? And you had to kind of trade different things to actually get value. And those didn't scale. And in fact, you couldn't really separate the value of a good from the good itself, right? So you can't get very far when 1 goat equals 36 yards of fabric. And this is the kind of thing I think I'm starting to see happen in the connectivity space. We're kind of using barter economies. And in the reality is we need to actually have a very different way of thinking about the currency of information we use as we flow stuff around. And you just can't get very far with a barter economy. And if we really want to make value across all the stakeholders, we need to think about how we actually share that information, secure it, and flow it. So Britain took the notion of a liquid currency very seriously back in the late 1600s. They appointed the smartest man on the planet to be the head of the Bank of England, right? And for the next 150 plus years, they dominated worldwide commerce just by adopting liquid currency, right? Isaac Newton oversaw the reminting of the coins. And it's not a coincidence they picked Isaac Newton, right? One of the smartest men who ever lived. This was before they had something called scientists. They were called natural philosophers. And his study was the study of nature to figure out how we could find those design patterns that might actually inform us in our world. In nature, the selection of a common currency, all of them mutating and recombining and replicating and flowing, this turned out to be a really big deal. This is why you and I are here today, is because we agreed on this, well, somebody, a long time ago, agreed on this liquid currency. You know, it supported amazing episodes of creativity and innovation. Think about the Cambrian explosion, right? You could recombine two different organisms and come out with something that nobody would mess with, right? And this was the way we evolved. It also means that when we talk today about things, you know, we can do things like take a goat today, we can combine it with human genes and human DNA and create transgenic, animals that actually produce human drugs. This is kind of amazing if you think about it, but we don't even think about it. Just, of course you can do that. We have one currency. So think about the innovation and the creativity that came out from adopting this design pattern. And multiply that out times what would happen if connectivity across the grid, across the world, took advantage of these patterns. So in economics, a liquid currency really revolutionized worldwide commerce. But I think we're now coming to an information economy, right? And the question is, right now we're taking computers and we're trying to move information. We think about it as sort of information's in the computer, we're going to move it to the handheld, we're going to move it to this other device, maybe we'll move it to a big server in the cloud. And we're starting to actually start moving stuff around. And that's great if you have a few billion devices. That's great if you have 4 billion cell phones. 4 billion is not really a big number when you think about it, right? When I say trillion, I mean a really big number. If you were to count back in seconds to 1 trillion seconds, it's 30,000 years ago in seconds. It's a big number. And most analysts are saying we're going to hit that within the next 5 years in terms of connected devices. So it'll be kind of like climbing an entirely different mountain. Instead of information being in the computer, we're going to have to rethink our paradigm and think about people, devices, buildings, cities, countries being in the information. It's going to flow all around us. It's going to be massively more than we see today. So it's a very different perspective that I think we need to be taking. And then you have to ask, how are we going to identify the information? If we start flowing this stuff around, how are we going to identify it? How are we going to know we're talking about the right thing? We talked about collaboration. If I knew the amount of information coming out of that home or that community, I might be able to take value from it. If you and I are talking about the same thing. And this lets us talk about another pattern in nature that I think we're going to have to implement if we really want to make the smart grid work. So here's a pattern we find in nature. And it turns out that it's at the very basic level, down at the atomic level. No two atoms can exist in the same place at the same time. Anybody remember hearing about this? It's called Pauli's exclusion principle. Right? Yay, somebody got it. Right? So stuff made out of matter has this unique identity that is given to it by the fact that it's atoms, and you can't have two things in one place. Which means you and I can point to a cup of coffee, and we know we're talking about the same cup of coffee. Right? We know 2 cups of coffee can't be in my hand at the same time in the same atomic configuration. So we must be both talking about the same thing. But it turns out information doesn't have this as such. Right? We get it from atoms. We need to kind of emulate nature if we actually want to do it for digital information. So something more abstract. Think about that. Moby Dick. Do I mean my copy of Moby Dick? Do I mean something else? Do I mean... maybe it's your copy of Moby Dick. Maybe it's all the copies of Moby Dick. What do I mean when I say Moby Dick? Right? And this is the question. Maybe it's the pattern of words on a page. Information doesn't necessarily have a unique identity. Think about it. I talk about my book. I talk about Moby Dick, maybe all of yours. Or I talk about maybe, just something else. Like I really want to talk about just the pattern, call me Ishmael. When I'm talking about that, how do we know we're talking about the same thing? And if you're going to be driving value in a smart grid, you need to know you're actually talking about the right thing. You need to be able to have a conversation about it. Do you remember the fable of the blind men and the elephant, right? One holds the tail, he says it's a snake. The other one holds the leg, he says, clearly, this is a column. And the third one pats the belly and he says, no, it's a wall. right? And each of them has a piece of the answer, but they can't even see the elephant in the room. And I think that's what we're going to be facing as we start connecting things together. This turns out to be really important, right? If we have that much information and we're trying to discover what's happening, we need to at least know what we're talking about. How do you collaborate? I mean, it turns out many confusions are about identity. When we try to talk, when we try to make decisions, when we try to add value, we think we're talking about the same thing and we're not. Right? This turns out to be a big deal. So, what's the answer? And I'm going to look back to nature again. Nature does it through atoms and Pauli's exclusion principle. But we can do it as well. There's this thing called a UUID. It's a universally unique identity. Mathematicians tell us if we generate a really long number, it's going to be universally unique. Not just in this database, not just in this computer, not just in building, this state, this country, this world, this galaxy, but universally unique in the universe. That's why they call it universally unique. And it's just generate a big number. It turns out that that's all you need to do. You can number every atom and have leftovers to spare, as long as you make the number big enough. So we could take something like that, and we could start attaching it to our information. Then we'd at least know we were talking about the same thing. And then you might say, well, what about resiliency? We just heard about some just horrible things that happened in Japan. And the need for a conversation around resiliency. Hart talked about, what if we actually were way more decentric, which is actually what nature does. And so this is an interesting question as well. How are we going to cope with resiliency? So it turns out that in nature, nature does something called peer-to-peer. So the skin cell on my toe doesn't actually talk to the skin cell on my ear. It mostly talks to its neighbors. It replicates with its neighbors, it moves information around with its neighbors. And then there are layered things on top of that, like a central nervous system, but at its core, it uses something called peer-to-peer. So I didn't understand peer-to-peer. I've heard it, I remember it from Napster. I know a lot of people don't like the sound of it because it sounds like it's piracy of some sort. And so there's a political problem with it, but it turns out every large complex system uses it as a means of gaining resilience. So I asked our research, our head of research, one of the founders of Maya, Dr. Peter Lucas, and I said, what's peer-to-peer? And he said, well, I'll explain it simply. You can't get rid of Moby Dick, even if you try. I said, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean I can't get rid of Moby Dick? He said it's massively replicated in a peer-to-peer system called a public library. Well, what do you mean? Well, every library can serve. Every library can request the data. It's massively replicated, not only in public libraries, but in bookstores, used bookstores, private libraries. You can't get rid of Moby Dick. Go ahead and try. You could try burning every copy. You would find another one. The amazing thing about peer-to-peer networks is they are incredibly resilient. And any one of those Moby Dicks can resolve the link. So 50 years from now, you could still find Moby Dick. That's an interesting statement. So I said, okay, I think I get it. Then he said, well, okay, think about that last URL or URI that you saw in the back of a research paper, a really important research paper about the smart grid maybe. And you picked up a book and you started looking and you saw this URL, this www.http something. What percentage of those links in that book or in that research paper do you think you'll be able to resolve in 5 years? What percentage do you think you'll be able to resolve in 10? Well, it turns out I've asked a lot of people who do this stuff every day, analysts, computer scientists, and they've all pretty much answered that maybe 1%. So 1% of the links in your most important research papers will be resolvable in 5 or 10 years. That's a little scary. And so, when I asked the analysts, well, how are you going to resolve this? And they said, well, we'll make copies of things that are really important. So how are we going to know what's important to our children? How are we going to know what's important to our own economy, to our own businesses in 10 years, 15 years? I mean, if that's the way we're going to resolve it, what are we going to do? Make 5 copies of things that are important? Maybe 10? So we're going to have cat videos. We're going to have Lady Gaga videos. Those are really important. Those are copied a lot. But we may not have the information we need to make an important business decision, and we may not have the important information we need to make a government decision, or a decision for my own family or for my community. Because I'm relying on someone who has to find shareholder value in keeping that information alive and keeping that server running in that location for 20 years. It's just not going to happen. Our children are not going to be proud of us for this, right? We just saw Amazon fail and lose a good portion, maybe 0.09%, right? Doesn't sound like a lot, but all those people who lost that information forever, kind of down, right? We just saw Sony go through a bad hiccup. So there are real things involved with this, and we need to think about it. So let me give you a way to think about it from nature's perspective. It was actually thought that the pigments that are in our eyes, that there are only one or two other organisms that code for this sort of blue eye pigment in nature. So Dr. Craig Venter, the guy who sequenced the human genome, decided to find out. He actually sent a vessel out into the ocean, and he started pulling up 5-gallon barrels of water in the northern parts of the ocean. And he just started straining them and sequencing them with his portable, gene sequencer, right? That was the last big struggle we had, was could we sequence the human genome? It turns out he did it in like half the time of the government, and he was able to turn it into something that's pretty amazing today. Well, as he started pulling up those organisms, and as he started looking down into their genes, he found way more organisms actually had the same gene that encoded this. In fact, if you looked at it, it turns out almost every species in the upper part of the ocean, in the warm parts of the world, use the same gene to encode for sunlight, for source of energy, for communication, right? Because nature replicated it massively. It's been used by all sorts of things to generate value. And in fact, in 1 barrel of seawater, they were able to find something like 1.3 million new genes, and as many as 50,000 new species. So when you think about the cloud, it might be better to think about the gene pool instead, right? Our oceans are like the biggest innovation factories in the world for storing life's information. They're sort of our big backup drive. It turns out that the lily, the common plant, lily, it has something like 10 times as many genes as humans. So it's like somebody's spare USB drive of all sorts of interesting information that we'll be able to harvest someday. So, do we have anything like this on the web? Do we have anything like this in the cloud? Do we have anything like this with any of the systems we're building for the smart grid? Do we have something that is a standardized container? Do we have something that has a universally unique identity? So we know the information we're talking about, we can secure the information we're talking about. Is it mutable and extensible, just like genes where you can add them and remove them from chromosomes? Can it be massively replicated by simple peer-to-peer networks with the most common basic mechanisms, not something fancy? Well, it turns out the answer is no. Down at the basic level, we have bits and bytes, and that's a really common currency for sort of computing as such. Pretty good. It doesn't have universally unique identity, not mutable. At the internet level, we've got the packet. The packet's pretty good. The packet's probably one of the most amazing inventions of mankind, right? It has allowed us to flow stuff around through the internet protocol, and it's a common currency. Again, doesn't have all the things we need, but it's got the beginning of it. And then you look at the web, and you say, well, does the web have anything? Well, it's got these URIs, but I just talked about how brittle they are, right? They're not universally unique. They're in fact stored, directed at a particular server in a particular place that someone has to keep alive. Maybe somebody says the semantic web or relational databases. Turns out those aren't good either, right? The row of the information in the relational database contaminates it such that it can't be removed. It's like having a barter economy here. So what if we did, though? And that was the question we started asking in our research. What if we had something, and we call it U-form, sort of universal form? Very simple. It's got a universally unique identity. You can kind of see it there. It's got attributes and values you can snap together, just a standard container. It's very simple. It's an abstract data type, just like a bit or a byte. It's also, you can add things to it over time. You can mutate, you can extend it. You can put links to other U-forms to it, so you can build out webs of inference. And it can be massively replicated by the most simple organisms that can be replicated, computing organisms. So it can do that computation down at the most basic level. Your socks can do the computation as soon as they start putting chips in socks, which I'm pretty sure somebody's already doing. I've already seen electric outlets that cost $10 that are internet devices that can do this, right? And so we're talking about this coming pretty quick. And I'm going to end with a little bit of a demo so you can get a sense of, okay, what happens if you actually build a system based on a liquid currency, based on nature's design patterns, and you start playing around with it. and allowing sort of genetic replication and all sorts of things. So here's a U form. It's just a container, just like a shipping container. You can add stuff to it over time. You don't need to be a sort of god database designer and guess at all the attributes of the future, because you will never succeed. You can just glue stuff to it over time, just like genes. If you look at it on a list, it looks like a list. If you look at it on a timetable, it looks like a timetable. If you look at it on a table, it looks like a table. So you can look at it different ways, and you'll still be able to understand it. You just open up the container, and you see if you see anything that has to do with bars or maps, and you pull them out. Very simple. So I'll show you what that looks like inside of a little petri dish that we have that lets us experiment with U-forms. So here's a U-form. It's that really long number there, starts there, and it's got some stuff in it. This is some of the attributes. It looks like one of the attributes is members, and it's got a few of these different little collections that it points to, Borisov, Torretino, etc. It looks like it's got a name. That's another attribute called a battle. I can pick this U-form up just like a shipping container, direct manipulation, and look at it a different way. Here I can see there are those different members. So that's interesting. Let me go ahead and close that. And I'm going to try to look at it in a different way. I'm going to open up a different organism to be able to visualize it. So this is a visualization organism called a table. And I'm going to drop it into a table. And I'll go ahead and open up the battle data so that I can actually see the members inside of it. And a table has certain ways of displaying information. It can show me things like the day this battle happened, the French commander, the number of losses, and other kinds of things. Well, I can clearly see this has to do with Napoleon. So let me show you what this data is about. Napoleon had this sort of disastrous campaign back in 1812 when he was marching towards Russia. So I'm going to try to recreate this famous visualization, but I'm going to do it by doing genetic recombination with some very simple visualization organisms and analytic organisms. So I'll start with this stuff, and I can see the French commander, I can see all this stuff. It's actually kind of hard to understand the data in this form. Maybe I can see patterns. I can see who had an outcome. Was there a defeat or a draw or a victory? I can see the Russian losses. It's a little hard to understand this. So I'm going to pick up all these U-forms, and I'm going to go grab something that will let me visualize it better. I'll pull up a map. A map is a very basic organism. It just understands latitude and longitude. So let's go ahead. I'll pick that stuff up. This is called direct manipulation. Humans have been manipulating things for a few million years. I put it onto a map. Oh, this is interesting. So now I see where the battles happen. So that's a good start. Maybe I could teach this organism something, right? Organisms can learn a little bit. Let's go ahead and try to teach it. I'll zoom in. And you know what I'd like to do is I'd like to change a few of these attributes. So I'll come in here and I'll change the text to the location so I can just see the location. Maybe I'll come in here and actually I want to understand who won or who lost each of these battles. So I'll go ahead and add another little graphic that shows me a down arrow for loss and an up arrow for win. You can see he won the big one in Borodino. Maybe I'll double encode it. Maybe I'll make the dots actually look like whether it's a win, lose, or draw as well. So I'll encode it so that a red means that they lost and a green means they won. So I'm teaching this organism something. You notice I'm not writing any code. This is a little bit of drop-down stuff. So now I'm going to go grab a totally different data set by a totally different group that actually collected data about his marches, the segments that he marched. As he walked, did he cross a river when they were marching? When did it happen? When did it begin? When did it end? What was the temperature? What were the troops? Think of this as maybe the utility collects some information and the homeowner collects some information. And it'd be really nice if we could put them together in some way. So I've got this data, but I kind of know that a map doesn't understand bar data. It doesn't understand like a beginning and an ending point. It doesn't understand those kinds of things. It'll throw it in this little thing called a timeout box because the organism doesn't know what to do with it. Sort of puts it in timeout like your parents, like my parents would do. So I'll go ahead and grab all these and I'm going to try it anyway. Humans try things. So I'm just going to do an experiment. I'll drop it on there. I didn't see anything happen. And it threw it all in this place. It said these U-forms don't make any sense. They are segments. I don't understand segments. So help me a little bit. Help me, maybe teach me how to cope with segments. Now, for those of you that aren't very geeky, hold tight because I'm going to pull this together and it'll make more sense. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull out a totally different organism that's built on U-forms that happens to understand lines and bars. So I'm going to pull that stuff into this first because I want to see if I can teach it. So it tries to take a guess. It's a dumb organism. Let me fix it. I wish these segments would encode, the number of troops by the thickness of the bar. That way I can tell if they had a lot of troops or a few troops. maybe I'll encode the color to be the temperature. That way I'll know if this happened during the winter or the summer. So I'll go ahead and do that. Right? Self-generated, automatically just opening up these containers, looking inside, figuring out what it can show you, helping you build things. Now I'm going to extract its symbolic genes, the genes that encode how it understands information. I'm going to extract it just like you do in a gene sequencer. And now I'm going to teach that other organism, the math, how to understand bars. So I'll come in here and I'll transplant it. So transplant the genes, and it goes, oh, wait a second, I had a bunch of stuff in my timeout box, but you just taught me how to visualize it, and I understand latitude and longitude. So I can put those bars onto the map. So let me clean it up a bit. Maybe I'll push all the bars back so that you can read it. I'll organize them by start date so we can tell when it happened, and kind of, I can see a fat red bar happened way below things. And then, it looks like a blue bar later, so maybe I can see a little bit of time. So I'm building this brand new organism. Maybe I want to teach it to visualize things. I'll say, show me the data, organize it by March segment, filter it by start day so I can kind of see it over time, give me a range slider because I just want to goof around. And I'm going to wind the clock back, and as I wind the clock back, I can see Napoleon's march. So two different data sets bound together at the last moment, and this is a technique called late semantic binding. We don't have to agree on much, we just agree on latitude and longitude, and you and I can both collaborate and understand things. I can see that he started with a bunch of troops in the summer. He marched, he had a loss at Krasnoy. These guys went off to Palatz and stopped. Then they kept marching, and then they had a big win in Borodino, and then they kind of, retreated in the cold, right? It gets colder out there. So a lot of people had confusion about, Napoleon lost a lot of his men during the crushing Russian winter. But it turns out it happened when it was a little warmer. It could have been dysentery, it could have been people deserting to go back and do their crops. By visualizing it this way, I've been able to take multiple data sets, put them together, and build a brand new unit. And what's more important is maybe just the idea that you and I could collaborate over this. So I could do things like if I mark this segment yellow, and I say, look, this is the one I'm worried about, it'll mark yellow everywhere, because it's one thing in the entire universe you and I know we're collaborating with. It'll mark in the table, it'll mark anywhere. So you and I can have collaborative discussions. This is called polymorphic visualization. You can look at it the way you understand it, I can look at it the way I understand it. Even things like ink. If I were to go grab a marker, ink is data. It means I care about something. I'm going to circle this area. So everything in the system is data. Everything has a unique identity. Ink has a unique identity. I can move it around. I could readjust it. Maybe later I want to turn it into a flyover so I can visualize some things. I can play with it. If somebody put it in a table, they could find out who drew it, when they drew it, what they cared about, what they were looking at the time they drew it. Everything is data, right? I can relabel it flyover or something. So this gives you a sense of what happens when you start to actually build systems that agree on a few things, one thing just above a bit and a byte called a U-form. And then you start looking at how humans and nature work to actually come up with new value. Now I could throw all this stuff away and I have a brand new tool that I built in 5 minutes. It didn't take 3 months for a developer. A random end user could actually do this. And so this is really powerful. And in fact, if you look at the results from the labs, we did this for the Defense Advanced Research Programs Agency, DARPA. They call them the sort of Department of Mad Scientists. And we saw a 400% increase in situational awareness and collaboration and 300% in understanding things. And it took 1 day to learn instead of 2 weeks. So these systems that are actually out there now and used 24 hours a day using this kind of thinking are used for critical decision making. And they've been able to build them so that they just work, and new functionality comes from the end users. Just like the Cambrian explosion, people create amazing new things. And so with that, I want to end. I want to just give you a sense that it is possible to look at nature's design patterns, not just for energy management, but also for how it handles information. And think about what happens if you guys are wildly successful. How are you going to cope with all that complexity? Thank you.